There are gardens in this world that do not grow flowers. They grow secrets. Secrets so deep that even the soil seems afraid to let them go. In Blackwood Hollow, there is such a garden. The roses there were redder than any blood I've seen, and the earth beneath them was thick, heavy, as though it had been feeding on more than rainwater. You were never meant to know what I'm about to tell you. In fact, some in this town would rather see me dead than hear these words escape my lips. But once you hear them, you'll never see the world, nor your own rulers, the same way again. Because the story of the Langridge family is not just a local tragedy. It is a blueprint for power, for corruption, and for how entire generations are enslaved without even knowing it. For 110 years, the Langridges owned Blackwood Hollow, not as landlords, but as monarchs in everything but name. They controlled the banks, the police, the schools, even the churches whispered in their favor. To cross them was to vanish. 7 people tried. 7 people are gone. And somewhere beneath their perfectly trimmed hedges lie 7 graves, unmarked, unknown, but not unnoticed. My grandmother used to work at Langridge Manor. For 40 years, she polished their silver and served them wine. But she also kept a journal, and in her words, hidden in a locked chest I wasn't supposed to find, are fragments of a truth so dangerous, I am not certain I'll survive bringing it to light. You might think you know how power works. Politicians, billionaires, influencers. But you've been shown the puppet show while the real masters hide in the shadows. This isn't just a history lesson. This is the anatomy of control, and by the time we're done, you'll never trust a smiling face again. 1938. America was still clawing its way out of the Great Depression. In towns like Blackwood Hollow, desperation hung heavier than fog. Businesses collapsed. Families fled. Hunger stalked the streets like a patient predator. And then he arrived. Harold Langridge stepped off the train with a tailored suit, a silver-tipped cane, and eyes that didn't just look, they measured. He brought with him a wife, Eleanor, quiet and hauntingly beautiful, and an entourage of men whose faces were always just a little too still. In the town meeting that followed, Harold spoke with the voice of a man accustomed to obedience. "This town has potential," he said, smiling as though he'd already bought the place, "with proper investments and proper leadership. Blackwood Hollow can rise again. Hope is a dangerous thing when men are starving." Within months, Harold acquired the shuttered lumber mill, the Blackwood Chronicle newspaper, and several key businesses. He hired local men, at wages that seemed generous to the broken but insulting to the free. They called him a savior, but even then there were whispers. Mayor William Porter, the last elected man with any true authority, warned in April 1939, one man should not control this much. 3 weeks later, the Chronicle, now Harold's mouthpiece, ran a series of damning articles: gambling debts, affairs, corruption. The townsfolk didn't question. By summer, Mayor Porter resigned in disgrace and vanished from Blackwood Hollow forever. Official records claim he died in Chicago, but when I investigated decades later, there was no grave, no obituary, nothing. My grandmother overheard Harold that night at Langridge Manor. Champagne flowed like rivers. Cigars lit in every corner. And above it all, Harold's chilling declaration: "Power isn't taken, it's given, by fools too blind to see what they hand over." The applause was thunderous, but outside the west garden was being fenced off, padlocks installed, and beneath its soft soil a different kind of seed was being planted. What happened to William Porter was just the beginning. The Langridges had learned early that true power isn't about wealth or office, it's about erasure. Erase opposition, erase memory, erase history itself.
The roses were Eleanor Langridge's obsession. From the moment the couple took possession of Langridge Manor, the estate transformed. Workers expanded the east gardens, planting hundreds of rare rose varieties imported from across Europe. Townsfolk marveled at their beauty, blooms so vibrant they looked painted, petals soft as silk. But whispers began almost as quickly. Servants noticed Eleanor's visits to the garden became nocturnal. She was often seen wandering under moonlight, clutching strange tools, long-handled spades, trowels stained dark. Her gowns, once pristine, came back streaked with soil. The west garden, however, remained a mystery. Enclosed by a tall, wrought-iron fence with a heavy padlock, it was strictly off-limits. Eleanor claimed it was reserved for experimental horticulture, yet no one ever saw flowers growing there. Only Harold and Eleanor entered, often late at night. One night, in July 1940, my grandmother wrote, "I was returning linens to the pantry when I saw them from the window. Mr. and Mrs. Langridge in the west garden. 2 lanterns glowed faintly. I could just make out their silhouettes, digging. The sound of metal scraping stone echoed faintly through the air. I froze. It felt wrong, like I was watching a ritual rather than gardening." Weeks later, strange smells began emanating from the west garden, earthy, metallic, almost sweet. When staff asked about it, Eleanor replied coldly, "Nature must be fed." By 1941, Harold Langridge had consolidated nearly all power in Blackwood Hollow. The council, police, and courts bent to his will. Those who resisted were crushed quietly. Thomas Green, editor of a small independent newsletter, dared to question Harold's finances in an article. Days later, his office burned to the ground. Green survived but fled town overnight with his family. Decades later, I found his daughter. She told me, "He never spoke of Blackwood Hollow again. Only once, drunk, he said, 'Never cross a man who buries his problems.'" Eleanor's health began to fail in the winter of 1956. Officially pneumonia, but her symptoms, hair loss, nausea, strange bruising, hinted at something darker. On her deathbed, she clutched my grandmother's wrist and whispered, "The west garden. He thinks I don't know what's there." Before she could say more, Harold entered the room. Eleanor fell silent. She died 3 days later. 6 months later, Harold married his secretary, Victoria, a woman with ambitions as sharp as her smile. The west garden remained locked, but Victoria began visiting it alone. Richard Langridge, Harold's son, grew into a cold, entitled heir. Teachers were instructed to give him perfect grades. Local children were encouraged to play with him. Most feared refusing. At age 10, Richard lost a foot race to a gardener's boy. Enraged, he demanded his father fire the man. That night, the gardener's family fled town. No trace was ever found. My grandmother noted, "It's as if the Langridges can erase people as easily as chalk from a slate."